Hello, good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever time of day you're choosing to listen. It's Hour of History. And this week we have the author Malcolm Harris, who has written the book Kids These Days, Human Capital and the Making of Millennials. It's going to come out in paperback on September 11th, 2018. And it's a fantastic book, and we have a great conversation with Malcolm, who has written for a variety of different publications. He puts out a lot of work that's appeared in things such as the New Inquiry, New Republic, Book Forum, Village Voice, N+1, and the New York Times Magazine. So stick around for a great conversation. This episode is brought to you by Robinhood. Head over to hourofhistory.com/Robinhood to create your portfolio and start tracking stocks for free. That's right. Robinhood lets you invest in hundreds of publicly traded companies without paying any commissions. Following up on your portfolio couldn't be made any easier than the Robinhood app, available on iPhone and Android and on the web. So go now to hourofhistory.com/Robinhood and sign up today, and you'll be entered for a chance to win free stocks from companies such as Apple, Ford, or Sprint. That's hourofhistory.com/Robinhood. So enjoy the excellent conversation we have today. And as always, you can head to hourofhistory.com/RECS to follow up on recommendations from this episode and every episode on Hour of History. Enjoy.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. It's Stephen Bauman, and I'm here this week with Matthias Fueling and Malcolm Harris. We've got a great conversation coming up for you.
I know. So Malcolm is the author of a new, fairly recent book, right? It came out, late 2017?
November
2017, and it's coming out in paperback,
September 11th.
September 11th, so coming out quick. Wow. Ooh, that's a heck of an anniversary to have your book come out on. It is Kids These Days, Human Capital and the Making of Millennials. But I think, weirdly enough, they altered the subtitle to make it Kids These Days, the Making of Millennials, and sort of removing a big topic of the book.
And, yeah. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm sure we'll cover a variety of topics. But first, why don't you just tell us, how does one come to write about millennials?
Well, it's not so much because I'm a millennial. It's interesting. There's no first person in the book. It's not about that. I started this project actually while I was at the University of Maryland, right in the wake of the financial crisis. I was at school with all these other kids who didn't really know what was going on, and I was with a student group called Students for Democratic Society. And we were running a campaign to try to fight a tuition increase that we thought was coming. And when the financial crisis hit, we said, great, we're going to do a teach-in, and we're going to connect this to we're going to connect the financial crisis to this student borrowing question. And we didn't know how they connected, but we figured that they had to somehow, which is the nice thing about leftists, right? Everything connects to everything.
Yeah.
And so as my roommate John and I started doing this research, we found that the student loan system is actually really, really important, as important as the housing system, which we didn't, at that point, that's what we were focused on because that's what we were organizing around. But the more research we did, the more important we found it in, a national sense. So after I graduated, I wrote a piece that took a lot of that research for the magazine N+1 about the student loan system. And it was one of the first pieces sort of about how it worked and that it was a problem. And after that, I thought about writing it into a book, but the more I looked into it, the more I found that you couldn't isolate the student loan system from all these other questions that were important for this generational cohort, and that they all, again, tied together. And so that sort of pitched me down the rabbit hole.
Nice. And when I read it, I noticed you did a lot of research for this. You were cobbling together a lot of stuff, and not just sort of other monographs and books, but you had the receipts. You were going to all the government websites and their own data. And you really put together, I think, a really composite picture there. Like, how did you go about doing the research? Like, what was your process?
It's probably really amateurish and very, very millennial in the way of like using Google and using Google well. That's one thing I learned growing up in Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, is I know how to use search engines really well. And public, research databases.
That's cool. I'm just thinking in terms of the university level and being an undergrad and using Google, like that's like pretty advanced to be engaging in these kind of debates. Like, can we go back even further? I too was a student at the same time, and I didn't like price increases, tuition increase, but I wasn't like doing research.
Well, it comes out of the organizing. And so I've been involved in left-wing organizing since, the invasion of Afghanistan when I was 12 years old or whatever.
Can you talk about that?
Well, it's just always been a big part of my life, I guess. I'm not sure what first inspired me to oppose the Bush administration as a 12-year-old. But I was there, man. I was in the streets along with everybody else, and there was a lot of us. And in school, you organize where you are, especially as a university student. So with SDS, we were focused on, democracy within the university and the role that students could play to democratize the university. So we had to know what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And people were only going to listen to us if we knew what we were talking about. And the nice thing about the data that I used is that you can find it if you figure out what you need to look for. It helps, I think. I'd been reading Marxist texts for a couple of years at that point, and so that perspective, I think, at least in our environment, gives you a real leg up on people who are using other perspectives, because I don't think they're as useful.
And one of the big theme in your book is this concept of human capital. Do you mind just sort of explaining what you mean by that and how it kind of connects with your argument?
Yeah, so human capital, which is that's the part that they cut out of the subtitle.
Funny how that works.
I resigned to let them try to sell the book without the big scary words, I guess. But human capital is basically the skills and abilities that you put to work when you go to work. So it's not just your labor time that you're exercising when you are laboring. It's also the accumulated skills and abilities. And the importance of those accumulated skills and abilities in labor has really increased over time, especially around the millennial cohort, and especially during our childhood. So the childhood of millennials, the conclusion I come to, has been really rededicated, centered around the production of human capital.
Now, I thought your book was actually I listened to it. I like to listen and organize
because you're maximizing your human capital, Steve.
Exactly.
You gotta listen to it and do something else, man.
No, but one thing you don't get like lost in vocabulary, or it's not off-putting. Like, your message is very straightforward. But can you talk a little bit about the decision to use terms like human capital, things that are tied up with Marxism? That clearly the publisher is a little worried about. Are you afraid that you're going to put people off with this vocabulary, or what's your thought process in the word choice in how you describe these phenomena?
Well, Marx and Marxism are not mentioned in the book, not one time. I think neoliberalism is mentioned once in quotation marks. So I actually stayed away from that vocabulary a lot. And human capital actually is not primarily a Marxist term. There are some Marxist thinkers who use it, not that many. Morgan Adamson, I think, is one who is really influential on my thought and someone that people should check out. But it's mostly a term of neoliberalism. It's a neoliberal term. Mm-hmm. And I use some of their work as well in the book, but they are the ones who are really obsessed with human capital in a very wistful way at the time. When the Chicago school is writing about human capital, they're oh man, what if we could really just get people to pay for their own human capital? What if we could invest in human capital directly? too bad workers have rights, basically.
Yeah.
Too bad workers, like can change jobs if they want to. And that screws up our whole plan. They hadn't, like, the scheme that we have going now was beyond even the fever dreams of the Chicago school.
And so, sorry, just so you can break that down for listeners, like a lot of our audience might not know Chicago school. Well, what are these things, and can you introduce some of your influences for someone who is new to this but interested in millennials, interested in this idea of human capital?
Yeah, let me look at the book here. I'm trying to remember how I use it exactly, or the quotes that I use.
Yeah.
But the Chicago School is a group of economists based around the University of Chicago who established the idea, the theoretical principles of neoliberalism. They're economists, and they sort of play out the full, almost sci-fi thinking of full marketization of society.
Mm-hmm.
They famously experiment with this in Argentina to disastrous effect.
Under Pinochet.
Yes. And then now in America as well. They've been very influential, especially on the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm. And the idea being that you can basically turn anything into a market system, and then that would produce better results than...
Yeah, especially with universities being market entities, right? The corporatization of the university,
like that Temple tea that we see.
Yeah. I mean, that was very much
everywhere.
just as grad students and teachers. When I was reading your book, Malcolm, I was like, that was very much on my mind, and you really sort of show this kind of historical change over like the last 30, 40 years, but very. It starts kind of slow, but very steady and accelerating process of. Universities no longer are technically places of learning; they're places of profit in a lot of ways, right? Mm-hmm. They're meant, students are not just here as just getting an education. They're part of a system that's sort of like milking them for more money in exchange for a kind of ever increasingly less marketable degree.
Yeah, and that's something I definitely got to see firsthand at Maryland, because that's one of those public schools, like Temple, I think probably ahead of Temple in this process, that has found marketization to be a real successful path forward. There's a book coming out soon called University of Nike. It's about the University of Oregon and their relationship with Nike and how Nike transformed the university as a whole. Maryland took that pattern as a model and is, trying to become the University of Under Armour.
Right.
Legit, really, really, really wants to do that. And recently this has led to the death of a young man, a football player, who died from overwork at practice. And we can, link those two things very directly. This is a corporate profit strategy that will, chew up and spit out young men, mostly young black men, for profit. And these are supposed to be, universities?
Yeah.
So that's what they're supposed to be about.
Can you explain the process of how that happened? How did we go from sort of this, I guess, kind of the bucolic, I guess, sort of imagery people have, prep school, and then for, kind of 1950s, so Animal House style. How did we go from sort of that to University of Nike and University of Under Armour? How did that happen?
The corporatization of public education in the U.S., some commentators and with some decent evidence posits a pretty direct relationship between neoliberalism and the fall in the federal and state contributions to public schools and corporatization, that then these schools had to go chase student money. I think my view of it is a little more complex, which is that the shift in human capital cost development from the state, where the state was bearing the costs of educating its populace, to individual workers and their families, goes along with this increase in competition between workers, and the idea that you can never have enough education, you can never invest enough into your education, becomes dominant. And the accepted wisdom is that you'll always be able to pay back whatever loans you take out. And as long as those loans are available, you might as well just take out more and more. And university administrations haven't looked at the system and said, how can we make sure we don't take this overboard? Because that's not what their incentives are. The incentive, if you're an administrator, is to push it as far as you can go. It's to get and spend as much money as you can, which is how a corporation acts. And a lot of these university presidents are drawn from the corporate world and go back and forth. And that's how they're managed. They're managed for, the spending of money.
I'm curious about the sort of like where you start this discussion and where you start tracing it to, because we just live in such a different society than before. Like, there's been a significant economic and cultural changes, from, I don't know, we could pick starting Harvard back when it's still a seminary or a theological institution, teaching a very specific skill, creating people to go spread religion. So where do you start that to trace it through the corporate rise? Like, what is your reference? Is there ever a bucolic university, or are they always looking after an end game?
No, and I don't have a sort of reactionary idea of higher education, that there's some golden period we can return to. And generally that's what you hear from people who talk about the diminution of state funding, that if we just put this money back, then we can go back to the way it was before, which was better. And that's not how I see it. But this particular, valence, the particular way it's going now, goes along with this, what I see is a periodized shift in training costs, the human capital development, which is training costs, from corporations and the state to individuals and their families. And that happens around the start of the millennial generation. And that's one of the reasons that I'm using this generational frame, is because I think it's germane. It fits the pattern of data we have in terms of how these things have shifted.
And just so we can put brackets on it, I mean, we would all consider ourselves millennials, I think.
Yeah.
What are the dates?
I used 1980 to 2000 because I like round numbers and to emphasize how arbitrary it is, because that part is arbitrary.
Yeah.
And it's really not about, what year you are born in so much as how you relate to the social changes that have occurred over that period.
Yeah, I like that one in the book, because it almost sounds like you're more saying millennial in a general sense is like people that are subject to this kind of economic regime in a certain sense. And there's kind of a cutoff where we can say 1980s where that process really kicks off. When I was reading your book too, and I don't know if it was in the book, it was a thought I had a lot, kind of also how this emphasis on young people need to go to college to better themselves also seems to like the explosion of college sort of like the rate of people going to college, it seems to explodes basically starting right after the period when kind of unions get like gutted and kind of like blue collar jobs get offshored and kind of destroyed. And then sort of the message seems to be, well, you can't just go work in a factory now. You have to like become like a trained person. Like you have to become a white collar upper class person. And so you need to go to college to do that. But then there's no other jobs available. And so kind of, right, everyone now, it seems the message is you have to go to college just to survive. Ergo, colleges can kind of now just charge whatever they want because they have no competitor to stop them, right? Because where else are you going to go to try and survive without that magical piece of paper?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it goes back even further, I think, to the Higher Education Act in the 60s, 1965, I believe, where you couldn't get enough Americans to go to college because wages were too high.
Yeah, I was like, why would I go?
Why would you? Well, and it wasn't even like college didn't cost, compared to now, nothing. It wasn't the cost of college, it's that you're going to spend 4 years not working. Yeah. And so you're basically agreeing to extend your adolescence 4 years. And when you're 17, 18, and you're like, you can go get a job, get an apartment, maybe get a girlfriend, get a wife, whatever, this is a patriarchal idea, but this was the idea. This was the concept, right? You had a single earner household, and you could be a, contributing adult member to society within a year or whatever, and it wasn't going to be that hard, and you didn't have to like better yourself to do it. It was hard to get people to go to college if that's the situation. you got to convince people to go work for nothing for 4 years. But then the problem was the Soviet Union was really good at getting people to go to college. And so America starts to fall behind in science and technology especially, but also literature and arts behind the Soviet Union, which is a really very coordinated system for the development of human capital, that if they think you're going to be a good gymnast or they think you're going to be a good scholar or whatever, you get the support you need and they make sure you're oriented down that path. So America takes what is at that point a very Soviet course, which is they start subsidizing education. So, well, if we can't get people to go to school for this much, what if we just cover the cost and you go to school and you can get a better job and you just pay us back with all the more money you're going to make from your fancy job? And this was pretty successful for a while, that people then took advantage of that and improved the American human capital stock at the cost of the federal government. And this is the Great Society, period or whatever. But then it becomes a question of how much can you get workers to train themselves? How much work and money can you get them to invest on your behalf as a corporation themselves?
And what is this also? There's more people that are able to go to college. Is this wrong? Like, the population of the U.S. is growing, as well as like civil rights movements and stuff. Is the population potential percentage going up at the same time? Yeah,
and especially women entering the workforce is the biggest change in terms of population and college attendance. And now we know very well that women attend at higher rates than men.
But all of this stuff starts long before college. And the primary education system, which, didn't necessarily do a good job of preparing students to read and write, even though that was kind of like the purpose of it, has existed in a similar format for many years.
Well, I might contest a couple of things about that, which is one, that its purpose is to teach kids how to read and write, because I think the main purpose
awesome.
in the book, at least, or from my perspective of the public education system, is not just this creation of human capital, which is a huge part of it, but also the channeling of children and the determining of life chances. The calculation of risk is really a huge one, and the development of risk profiles for individual children. And that's an increasing part of primary school, secondary school during this period. And I think that's really affected the way millennials have come up.
Yeah, and I think, and as well, when I was thinking, I was reading your chapter on the book, I think the title was like work. Like parentheses sucks, and it was interesting too.
Blink-182 reference from millennials
is you I like how you also tie this not just with sort of like childhood and risk sort of management, and then to college, but then you track that onto then kind of the precarity of work, right? Is also another side effect of this kind of corporatization and kind of marketization of everything. So maybe it'd be fine if everyone was going to college if everyone really was guaranteed a good job, but increasingly you're arguing, and it just seems sort of obvious, at least to me, that jobs are becoming incredibly sort of precarious, right? Precarity, right? Where you don't have kind of a corporate structure where you're going to get a pension or insurance, and it's always kind of a rat race where, they can always find someone else who has a college degree to do the job. And so kind of this corresponding element that more and more people are becoming educated for an ever sort of less beneficial work environment.
Which seems opposite, right? Because if you think on an individual level, and this is really shows you just how weak the discourse is around these questions, and how much we haven't even bothered to think about it, and how much we've just accepted the lies we've been given. Because if you think about it at all, on an individual level, yes, it's true. The more education you get, odds are the better your life's going to be, the better jobs you're going to get, the more money you're going to make, all things being equal. That's still true. That might even be, it is increasingly true in some ways. But on a population level, the more human capital you generate overall in the labor market, the more educated workers become in general, the less valuable it is. That's just really basic supply and demand stuff that if everyone wants to learn to code because being a coder is a good job, suddenly there are all these people who know how to code. You don't have to pay coders as much.
Mm-hmm.
And coding is not such a good job anymore. And that's going to happen in the next 10 years, just straight up.
But Elon Musk says we should teach everybody how to code.
Yeah, that lowers his labor cost. And that's why, and seriously, like Google is, touring the public schools saying, teach everyone how to code. Maybe we'll give some of them jobs. And what they're doing is they're reformatting the public education system paid for by taxpayers to create the kind of human capital that they need at their company, which will allow them to decrease wages for the workers they do end up hiring. So they're using our public education system to teach us stuff that we may or may not need or use, that they may or not need or use. It's not their time, so what do they care? In order to improve their bottom line and, decrease wages for workers. It's a bad situation.
Which this is something that's been done in education for a very long time, even going back to I studied Quakers, and the Quakers starting some of the first public schools, schools for people who would not be able to go to school, and they're teaching them things to do that almost anyone could do, but that don't want to do, but specific to get them out of it. To get it out of what we need in New York City, we're going to teach these kids, to clean streets. Mm-hmm. And we're going to call it school. So this is like a kind of a human phenomenon, isn't it? What do we...
No, it's a historical phenomenon. I mean, that first generation of schooling, even, there were class struggles over the imposition of schooling on children in the first place. So the end of child labor was a really fractured time, and it's because kids were fighting to maintain their jobs. You're saying kids who, it's hard to think about it this way, but kids who had jobs in factories or whatever were getting pulled out and put in school. And if you're a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever, and you've got a job, and they say, actually, you're going to have to sit in this classroom all day, and we're not going to pay you anything for it. That sucks. You don't want to do that. You got a paycheck.
It's really interesting too. In the reverse, I talked to a guy who fought in the Cuban Revolution this summer, and he was telling me about how he had before worked all day, and that was why he fought. So his kids didn't work, and they just went to school. It's almost like a reverse, because the revolution guaranteed that they weren't going to have to work.
Yeah, I mean that's a difference in societal values, certainly.
Right, but I think also probably with the case of human capital and where we live now in the States, it's also a question of impositions, right? Like life choice, where it seems increasingly right with the corporatization of education, with basically kind of the birth cohorts after 1980. It's sort of like your ability to choose your life chances is ever increasingly diminishing, right? Mm-hmm. And you're more and more kind of at the whim of big businesses, perhaps even from elementary school, if we take kind of the logic to its extreme conclusion, right? And it seems especially, I don't know about your ideas with Betsy DeVos, it seems very malevolent where even the government is sort of saying, well, we're just going to privatize education entirely almost with the rise of charter schools. And that's, and then that seems sort of like setting yourself up to where, I mean, are we all going to be going to schools and or will our children or grandchildren go to schools that are basically just privatized and run by big businesses to train them specifically for their corporation or something?
But I wouldn't just blame Betsy DeVos or the Republicans, who I think are terrible. But if you go back to the Obama administration, you look at the Obama era rhetoric around public education, it's all about job preparation. That's every single speech. If he's talking about education, he's talking about jobs. And that makes sense because jobs are important and people are worried about their future and et cetera, et cetera. But this was a shift that happened from, talking about education in a more holistic, maybe liberal, John Dewey sense to education is to get a good job. And you want to get a good education so that you can get a good job. And if we need to get more kids a good education, then we'll have more jobs. And it's that last sort of policy step that's just wrong. And we found out it's wrong, but that hasn't stopped anyone from pursuing that path.
I think part of the problem too is that this has been going on for a long time. We haven't had a Secretary of Education who taught in a public school since Reagan. Our Secretary of Education, not saying that would mean you can run a whole department, but you should at least know what it's like to teach in a public school for more than a year, or so we're appointing business people to run the schools. Like, it's not going to be much of a surprise, but how do you even change that narrative? It's been generations. It's been, generation after generation of the business. Let's create these student products. Like, if there was no golden age, where do we find the impetus to change? How do you change a school?
I'm not particularly invested in the persistence of schools. I think there are other ways of transmitting knowledge, of pursuing knowledge. And so the question of how to maintain schools, how to transform schools, how to redirect schools doesn't consume a lot of my thought, frankly. I'm not an expert on it. I spent 3 years in college, and that was it. So I've never particularly gotten along well with schools and schooling. So I'm maybe not the one to ask on that.
Well, no, that's fine.
That's interesting.
Well, it's like the old kind of Foucauldian, schools are places of discipline, right, and punishment, not necessarily of like enlightenment per se.
Well, and the maintenance of class domination, which is I used to have my Foucault on education posting, and that's what that's what he's really saying, is that the schools, like the hospitals, like the prisons, are instruments of class domination, and I don't think. It's hard to look at them and not understand that if we're looking at them with any sort of critical eye.
So, if you had a child then, and you're not sold on the school idea, what do you do?
Oh, geez. I have not had to confront the question of responsibility for a child. No, but I chose to go to school insofar as I had a really, hard time in some ways with school and formal schooling, and my mom offered me the chance to drop out and pursue education on my own terms, and I was afraid to miss the socialization that came with school as much as anything. I think I probably sacrificed education in going to school for me personally, which I don't think I regret necessarily, because I would have plenty of time to read books. Developing a functional, social presence is a little more of a limited window. So it's hard. So schools do a lot of things in terms of formatting people and integrating them into their society. Some of that is sadly necessary if you want to be functional in some ways.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting, kind of shifting away a little bit from kind of just focusing on school and education. I think it's just a byproduct of we're grad students and teachers too.
Sure.
But I think your question, I think your chapter on kind of behavior modification, I found maybe the most troubling of the chapters, where you go into a lot of detail about charting the explosion in the rates of kind of prescription drugs among people basically born after 1980. The explosion, and you had all the really incredible data showing just the accelerated rate of anxiety, of ADHD, of depression, and just sort of a whole range of psychological problems that are arising out of this new kind of economic relationship. And I wonder, were you shocked by that? Did you have any kind of moment where you how could this be real? But it does very much track with my own experience, because it's you talk to lots of young people, or I guess people kind of 30-ish and under, and it does seem that questions of anxiety and depression are way more prevalent than in the case if I attempt to talk about those issues with older people. And it seems to be more than just a case of, they're older and they don't want to talk about it, but more it's a new phenomenon that they can't relate to.
Yeah, when I went into that part of the book and the research for it, I was really skeptical at the whole idea of measuring longitudinally across generations questions of mental health, because the discourse around mental health changes so much over time. And so to compare our, rates of depression with rates of depression in the 50s or something is so hard to do, because the way we talk about the questions of depression or mental health or like the mind-body relationship have changed so much during the period. But there are people who work on these questions, and when I reviewed the research, it was pretty compelling. And it makes sense. It tracks with the rest of the research that I've done. And if you live in a world that is, less trusting, that is more competitive, that's going to have effects on your mental health, and that we are collectively doing that. So I was surprised, especially at how dramatic the numbers were, but maybe I shouldn't have been so much so.
The one thing I've noticed as a teacher is in the last few years, my students, so these are the post-millennials.
Generation Z.
I'm skeptical about the existence of I'll let you go on, but I'm skeptical about the existence of a post-millennial generation. But
interesting. Well, this is what I'm going to say about them is I see a lot of the similar things. So, like, I agree with Matthias. Like, a lot of the older generations won't necessarily understand when I talk about, like, having a panic attack or something, whereas people my age in the millennial generation are like, yeah, I get those too. There's a common language. But in the next generation, there's a vocabulary and a shared understanding much greater than what we have.
But then they're also under probably accelerated pressures in a sense. Right?
But what I'm saying is the response, there is a response, whereas it seemed more like chaos for millennials.
Mm. Which is why I think they might actually be the millennials, right?
We're the transitional.
It could be. So these things are really only determined in retrospect and have to do with like much bigger social questions. So the millennial dilemma is nowhere close to resolved yet. And people born between 1980 and 1990 might not be the ones to resolve it. And therefore, in retrospect, we might not think of them that way. The way we think about things now is so dominated by this like marketing discourse, basically. And that's who really dominates generational, comparative generational studies, is marketers. And they're incentivized to be the first to coin things. And so they mostly use consumption data because that's what they're talking about. And it's the easiest to find. And so you can talk about 14-year-olds in terms of their consumption because we can measure that. It's really easy. And marketers are invested in doing that. But I don't think you really know much about a cohort from their consumption patterns. That's a particular idea of the world. Whereas I want to know about them in terms of their relation to production, which is harder to measure and harder to understand of a cohort that is, pretty young. By any measure, the cohort below millennials has got to be pretty young.
Right.
And so to talk about them coherently, we're going to lean towards consumption questions. And I think that gives us a really tilted view. So I try to hold off about speaking about them till we have more information, a little more intelligible. Which doesn't mean they shouldn't, self-create their generational identity if it's different than millennials in some way. I'd be totally interested to see that, but I also haven't really seen it. It seems like, especially politically, we're part of a block.
Gotcha. And I think you kind of riffing off something you mentioned there, you're talking about sort of relation to means of production and like sort of your earlier points about class, because it is, I think, a weird moment we're living in historically where more and more people are becoming educated in the sense that just not just by kind of like a stamp on a piece of paper, but actually I would argue probably baseline substantive knowledge about the world is increasing. And yet it seems though that for most of human history, right, people at the bottom of a class structure are not well educated, and often intentionally not so in terms of, right, because that affects their ability to change the structure. And so it's sort of how I guess kind of get your thoughts on how does this function where we're seeing a new, ever kind of more rigid class structure, income inequality is exploding, the rich are getting exponentially more richer. with a bottom class that is, at least in the United States, it's becoming ever more educated, and yet at the same time, their life chances are declining, or kind of their quality of life in terms of the long-term future seems to be on the decline.
Does this set up social tensions? Yeah, I think it does. But I would question the connection about education and class position. I think that's probably true about formal education, about accreditation. But I don't think that necessarily even correlates with like education or knowledge about the world. I don't think what's stopping the oppressed of this country, any country in the world, from changing the system is their lack of understanding of it. So I think that's worth stating. But yeah, there's a problem, especially with the media and people's like ability to see directly, news items or project their own experiences into the world and be seen, has had a distinct effect on how we relate to questions of justice and injustice.
So this is I don't mean to be like outside of your realm of what you write about.
Oh, why not?
You write about America for sure, but I'm just curious about your what you think about China, because China has a way of suppressing these social tensions with a government that can shut down social media, for say. Whereas the United States doesn't necessarily have like a shut-off valve. The United States could have social tensions that, exploded to a volcano-like eruption, whereas I see China as sort of controlling it and sort of surpassing us on the world stage. What do you think about China?
Well, interesting. This is the first podcast announcement, but I just heard that it's going to be translated.
Oh, yes. Congratulations.
For the Taiwanese market. Which I heard is also how uncensored books make their way to the mainland.
Mm-hmm.
So look for that sometime in the next year and a half or whatever. So I'm excited to see what they make of the book itself. In terms of social tensions and shutting it down, I don't know. China has to my understanding, as a non-expert, a diverse way of resolving social tensions, and that their authorities actually have a much, depending on who you are and where you are, a much broader capacity for addressing resistance. Mm-hmm. So if something like Ferguson happened in some town in China outside of the main cities, you remove the whole local leadership,
right?
Come back to the party and said, "We're so sorry. Here's a bunch of money. We removed those other guys, those government guys that you hated. They suck. They're all fired. Here's some new ones." And so then, at least this is my understanding, that in at least Han areas of mainland China, the PRC, that outside of the cities, that you have the ability of people to revolt and seek redress, and because of the state of the economy and that rate of economic growth, you can pay people off basically. But at the same time, it's becoming, I think, clearer to the world, and again, as not an expert, that they are dealing with racial questions of racial inequality much in the same way that the American government has, which is by creating giant prison structures and tracking people. Mm-hmm. And that's very different. So, yeah, I don't know that much about China. That's the extent of my knowledge of China. But states in this time will pursue a variety of overlapping strategies for addressing social tensions, depending on who you are and where you are, and their ability to do that has sort of belied a bunch of class reductionist Marxist accounts of what should be happening right now, and the ability of states to continually maintain divisions within the working class. Has outpaced some theorists' imagining of such.
Yeah, because it certainly seems all these kind of theories of the rise of authoritarian capitalism or something, right? Because it sort of seems like now it seems so naive when people are talking about capitalist democracy and kind of
right.
all that seems very funny now to people because we laugh, right? Because it seems like so obvious when we look at it that, if democracy gets in the way of profit, well, much the worse for democracy then seems to be kind of the process that's happening. And I when I was reading your book, I kind of found it refreshing that you don't have like a kind of moralizing, uplifting kind of conclusion, right? I've actually found that very refreshing. And rather than sort of saying, well, here's my solution, people come together. It was very much like, well, there may not be a solution really. It seems very bleak at times when we look at the long-term kind of projections.
It's funny. The only people who say that are historians. Every historian says that
because we don't predict the future.
Yeah. Everyone else is like, why don't you talk about what's gonna happen? Why don't you talk about how we can change it? Why? And every historian's like, yes, love the ending.
Is any state doing things at least well in your estimation? Is there any government who's responding in a way you say? We read in the news and say, well, that's constructive.
Well, I would say it's classified as a statelet or a non-state. But in the Rojava region of Syria, that's run by the Syrian Democratic Forces, is the military organization that has put in place Öcalanist thought, named after Abdullah Öcalan, who is currently in a Turkish prison. I think has been really incredible.
Can you explain that for the non-Öcalanists?
Well, people should look it up because
it is cool.
It has not penetrated even much of the left except as a joke, which is too bad. And people should go and read the theory, read Democratic Confederalism, which is the pamphlet. Democratic
Confederalism.
Because Öcalan wrote that, right?
Introduction, yeah.
Yeah.
And this comes out of the Syrian war.
Well, it predates it. But that ideology and that practice, which is as much feminist as it is Marxist, has been the source of all their resilience and their success in this impossible military and social situation. So I think we can definitely look there for a lot of inspiration in terms of how they've trying to set up their society in the 21st century. And it is self-consciously an ideology for the 21st century.
That's a pretty interesting thought. Can you talk a little bit, this going back now, a little bit about being from Silicon Valley?
Sure.
How has that impacted your thought, and what is that? How does that factor into the human capital? They seem to be pretty focused on that.
Yeah, very focused on human capital, both as an industry, as a society, as a place that is all based off of housing prices, which are based off of the quality of the public high schools. That's why people live there. That's the entire reason people live there. That's why I lived there. And it's a sort of a messed up place. It's pretty twisted. I went to school with Jeremy Lin. We used to play pick up the ball at the Y. And that dude was very focused. You got to see a real model of focus and drive and success in a lot of people. But you also saw the consequences of what a society based that way looks like. And so Palo Alto is known for hosting one of the worst suicide clusters of young people in the country. And when I was there, it got so bad that they had, mothers who would sit at night in folding chairs by the train tracks because the train tracks went through both high schools. And that's what kids would use to kill themselves. And so they couldn't figure out any other way to get teenagers going to school in one of the best school districts in the United States, whatever, to stop ending their lives other than to, physically watch to blockade the entrances.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people point to Jeremy Lin and, Jeremy Lin's wildly successful, goes to Harvard, plays in the NBA. He
didn't want to go to Harvard, for the record.
Interesting.
He didn't get recruited by any D1 schools. This is I'm not revealing any.
So he's not a
secrets.
Total
No.
human
Jeremy was
success.
his story was that he was a constant failure, that he couldn't get the starting job, no schools wanted him, that he had to keep fighting, and he was very, very focused. I don't know why to go a little off topic, I don't know why the Christians don't use him as like a real model. Because that was something where like his faith in God really kept him so totally focused in a place that can be so soul killing. They should really use that kid as a spokesmodel.
And do these people who are successful, are they bright enough stars that it blinds out these tragedies? These suicides are happening. Like, how does a society continue on?
Not for me.
Not for you.
So that's who the book is dedicated to, are the classmates I lost. So I think remembering them is definitely important.
Yeah.
And, the shining stars, there are a lot of classmates that I went to school with who work at, Google and Uber.
Yeah.
But, like, they don't necessarily live the most fulfilling lives. It's not like they are, so overwhelmingly happy that it was worth, the kids who died. They're producing a lot of money, like, no doubt, like, for the economy per person. My high school classes, like, probably produced as much capital as, like, any class that doesn't include some particularly rich person, ever or whatever. So it's been useful for American society in this way, but I don't think we're worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also your chapter on kind of like the stars and kind of this ferocious competitive drive that's being inculcated in people now, where I think of like that stupid line from the movie Ricky Bobby, like Talladega Nights or something, where it's like, if you're not first place, you're like last or something.
If you ain't first, you're last.
Yeah, and I think it's it's meant to be sort of a stupid line, but I think that is a kind of a driving thing that most people think these days, right? Where you're striving for ever greater, like, I gotta be best in my class, I gotta get this job. I mean, even as grad students, I think Steve and I were kind of under that same pressure of like, we're striving to kind of become the best and the expert at this sort of like, niche echelon field or something, and yet sort of this idea that people can be unexceptional and still be decent, worthy human beings seems to be sort of increasingly dropping from public discourse.
And it's not like you're pursuing we'll use your example of you guys, because
it's a good one.
It's not like you're in doing this, you're like obsessed with being the best fucking historian that you can, and that you're like, you want to be like Genovese or whoever. You're just like, I'm going to produce knowledge that no one's ever thought of before or whatever. It's not self-directed. It's how, I'm going to be the best when the job market comes calling. When they're looking at CVs, they're going to see this and they're going to be like, that's it. That's the best guy. Or they're going to, they're going to hear about me. They're going to see me coming. Et cetera, et cetera. And we can look at the Avital Ronell scandal at NYU, and you can see where these dynamics lead, and that it's a strategy of domination. It's a labor strategy.
Yeah, the more you sort of kowtow and kind of debase yourself, the greater will be your sort of reward in the end, type thing.
Which is not true. And in fact, it's the opposite. In fact, if you're in a position where now you're going to be fighting with all these other same people for the same gigs, and again, this raising the level of competition doesn't help any individuals, not the ones who are themselves competing. Raising the level of competition advantages the people who are hiring them or employing them in some way.
But what about that? I'm sure we're going to have some listeners thinking, Stephen and Matthias, they're sitting in the same class, and then Stephen sees Matthias writes this awesome, kick-ass article, and then maybe that inspires me to write an article. Is that not true? Like, at some point, that competition is pushing me forward a little. Like, Matthias came in just absolutely jacked the other day. He's been lifting a lot, and I was like,
not so jacked anymore.
I like lifting, and then I started going to the gym more, right?
But there's friendly competition, and there's where you like push each other to greater heights.
Right.
And then there's like, I'm going to like delete your files.
Yeah. Or if you don't produce the best article, you're like screwed. Right.
Right. You go hungry.
Yeah.
Or you don't get to work in this field that you've put so many years into, that you care about so much. And that's what it really comes down to for so many people, is that you don't get to do the thing that you like care about. And they call that entitlement, but that was like supposed to be the premise of societal progress.
Yeah,
is that
can be happy.
More and more people would get to spend more and more time focused on the things they care about. And that we would spend our time on, producing beauty, producing knowledge, creating things, not in desperation, constant desperation. And we haven't found that. In fact, we've sort of abandoned that whole premise.
So I think we're getting kind of near the end here. And I think, Steve, I was thinking maybe we could end it with you and I kind of talking about like personal life stories, maybe a little bit. I don't want to get like pry too much about. So where you're reading it, where you felt like that connected with you. Because I had that a fair amount while I was reading the book. Sort of like, it seemed like this was speaking to me in a sense of like, wow, yeah, as a millennial, I relate to this in a very deep way.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, how about you go first?
You put me on the spot.
Yeah.
No, it
We're
was
in competition, Steve.
It was really hard reading it was actually a struggle reading the school sections, because having taught in schools and I've taught both. I've taught in public school. I worked in a charter school, and seeing students quantified and graded for basically their production, these human beings, and the idea like, we can have music if it raises scores.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing these things in the back of my head, and that kills me. And so that was really real when you're describing the production of schools and like what are schools for type thing. We need to have some serious thought about that.
Yeah. And I think for me, I think it was sort of talking about like kind of the chapter on labor and a little bit of precarity. Because I was thinking about it and I was like, I have moved literally every year since 2008. I was thinking about it in one form or another. Maybe not a big move. Maybe it's like, okay, I'm moving to a new building, or I'm going to this place for the summer, but I'm always constantly going somewhere else and taking lots of my personal belongings with me. And I was like, that relates to me, this idea that I am in a precarious situation, because I always have to sort of, for years, I was literally having to kind of just bounce around trying to find some sort of stability. And I think actually this past year in Philly, it's been the first year since I graduated high school where I was like, I've just been in one place for a year and just lived in my apartment. And it was amazing.
Right.
That sucks. And that's like, you got to think about that as like, a decrease in living standards, and as a cost that is, borne by you on someone else's behalf. Because what are you doing really when you're moving that much is you're trying to make yourself useful to capital, right? To like the one employer that exists. You think about it as the single employer, right? You're trying to make yourself, maybe, do you want me over here? What about if I'm over here? Better over here? Okay, I'll go over there. And that's cost. However you measure it, that's cost. Moving sucks. Everyone hates moving.
Yeah.
It's like the worst thing.
Gandhi wrote that it was a successful life if you never had to move more than 5 miles away from your home. This is a man who was educated in Britain, made his career in South Africa.
There's a failure for you, Gandhi.
Awesome. And then we finish our episodes with one recommendation. This is for the listener, the person who's looking for something from this conversation to follow up, or just a good life pro tip. So, Matthias.
I can start. Oh man, so I was in DC this weekend doing horrible conspicuous consumption. And I went to this. Steve, you might know it. It's like a Cuban coffee drink with the Cuban sweet cream.
The
crema, and then they get like a bunch of shots of espresso, and it's just incredibly strong, incredibly sweet. I think it's Cubano or
Cafe Cubano
Cafe
or
Cubano.
Cafecito.
So I would say, ladies and gentlemen, and if you have never had like Cuban coffee, go out, find somewhere and get Cuban coffee. That's my life pro tip for today.
Whew. That's a big one. Malcolm?
Okay, well, I'll stick with food, which is the Bob's Red Mill. You may have seen their products on the shelf. If you go on their website, you can order a bunch of stuff, and if you order like $50, they'll ship it to you for free.
Whoa.
Which is actually, let me make the anti-capitalist appeal there real quick, which is like, if you take a car and you drive to the store and you put a bunch of flour in your car and drive it home, that's like way less efficient than having a logistics company like bringing flour to your house. Not to mention, Bob's Red Mill, wholly worker-owned co-op.
Whoa!
Most people don't know that. So check out their website.
Excellent. We'll link to that in the program description. And then for my suggestion, I'm gonna do sort of like abstract suggestion because like why not? I can do it whatever. I'm gonna suggest the conversation because this week like
The movie?
no just average conversation.
The movie's pretty good too.
Is that a movie?
The Conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gene Hackman.
Yeah.
Okay, well
Francis Ford Coppola.
no, but that's not my suggestion. No, my suggestion is an actual conversation. No, talking to people. I encourage in each class, you know, for these students, we start by just talking about like a current event or something that's happening. And I've noticed even within a week, just the fact that I force them to talk to each other or say, why don't you just talk to someone new today in the class setting? The class morale is just 1,000% higher
Nice.
rather than just coming in, sitting down, opening their book and getting a lecture. So go and say hello to someone. In Cuba, it happens all the time. And we can do it in America, too.
More Cubanness. Is
More Cubanidad. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
The book is out September 11th, 2017
Paperback.
in paperback.
2018. What year is this?
2018. My God. We're here already. So, yeah. And Malcolm Harris, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
What a pleasure. We're going to link to everything on the website. It's Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for joining.